Okay, we are back on tape. This is take 2 of the interviews with Wade and Vivian Hayes. It's July the 12th, 2001, and we have just finished 1 hour. And Grandma was in the middle of telling us about her religious upbringing, and she just told us a story about when she was at girls' camp for the Pentecostal church. She saw a mural showing all these people burning in hell, with the caption saying, these people are in hell because you didn't pay your missionary money. And she knew that wasn't true, and it stuck with her, and she wondered and pondered about that, and it all made sense to her when she heard the gospel. She was just now starting another story about significant religious experiences that she had prior to the time that she learned about the church and met Wade. And that's where we are.
Then I was, after, when I joined the Pentecost Church, our preacher's name was Brother Bruton, B-R-U-T-O-N, and his daughter was my best friend. Her name was Naomi. And then she had a younger brother named John. And so I heard later that John was the one that mounted to something later. I don't know what, but they thought he was the one that was a great accomplishment. And so he and I were friends too, and we liked to just talk, like y'all talk. And so we got to talking about religion, and so we talked about this, great is the way, straight is the gate, narrow is the way, and broad is the gate that leads to destruction and hell. And so we knew from the sermons that we had heard that nearly everybody is going to hell. And just the few chosen ones will make it to heaven, and that by the skin of their teeth. But everybody else, most everybody else is going to hell. And so I remember saying, we're better off never to have been born, if that's true. And so that was a serendipity thought that stuck in my mind, that if that is true, and they preach it every week, every time they have a sermon, come and join the church so you won't go to hell. And that was what reason I wanted was religious, because I was scared to death to go to hell. I'd heard all of that, so that's all I had ever heard. And so I really wasn't religious because I loved the Lord. I was scared of Him, and I said, "You've got to be religious, or you're going to burn in hell." And so that was another thing that whenever I first heard about the church, I met Wade, and then we had religious talks, and he said there is a way that's provided for everybody to have a fair shot at accepting the Lord. And I thought, that sounds so good. And also, he gave me the doctrine of pre-existence, and that was really a great thing, which comes to our first conversation. Maybe you better ask me a question now.
Well, tell me about how you and Grandpa met. And I heard a little bit that you had a mutual friend that knew that neither one of you were attracted or addicted to alcohol.
Yeah.
And you met, and so tell us about your how you met him and your courtship.
Okay, it was the first time that I met him. Now, Betty had been telling me, you ought to meet Wade. He is so good looking, and he is a real good guy, really religious. And so I thought, well, I would like to meet him. And so we were living in Betty's apartment, my sister and her younger daughter, her young daughter, and me. And she was sending me to business school. And
Betty's your sister?
Betty was the landlady. she was Wade's boss. And see, this little niece of mine was a dancer also, and she was an instructor for Betty, and she got her dance lessons. She would take her to Chicago once a year for her to learn all the routines. Betty ran a dance school, but she couldn't dance. And so she had Wade to do her ballroom teaching, and Charles Jean did a lot of the tap stuff with the little kids. So she said, let's see now, we had, so how I really met him then was one day, Betty kind of stuck her head in the door and said, he's here. And it's because he would come and he'd spend the night on her back porch. And at that time, he was so new in the church, he drank coffee all the time. And so he was in there in her kitchen, and he would drink coffee in there. And so I got my sugar bowl and went into Betty's room and, the kitchen. I came to borrow some sugar, And so she said, oh, okay. And she introduced us, Vivian, this is Wade, etc. And so he had been to see, what was that movie star's name? That was Hedy Lamarr in Ecstasy. And so nowadays, when we'd say, a Mormon, that's an R-rated movie, they didn't have them rated in those days. But he thought it was artistic. And so he was telling me about it, how this young girl had been, was married to a cruel man that wasn't sensitive to her feelings or anything. And he was mean to her, but he was wealthy and all. And then she met this poor man who couldn't even, he said, the rich man, and he was sitting in a chair, Wade was, and he says, the rich man was sitting in a chair like I am, and says, there's a bug.
In his newspaper.
And so said he knocked it off, and then he just moved his chair over there and ground the bug in the floor. And then the young sensitive man, I guess when he saw a bug, he took care of it and he treasured life. And so then she fell in love with the poor man, and Wade could really understand that, And so that was what our first conversation was about. And I went in, I met him. And it wasn't very long, and he called me. And I couldn't believe he was calling me on the phone, but he did, and we talked. And so then he would come when he didn't actually ask me for a date, but he would come, like if he was teaching classes, or if he went to a dance or church or whatever he went to, he'd always come back to Betty's house. And so I would be sitting on the front porch, and he'd come and we'd sit on the porch swing and talk about everything. And then one time he did come, and he says, let's go down to the park. And there was, this was one of the first, it was a date, I guess, because he didn't have money to take me anywhere, no car to go in. And so we just had to use what facilities there was, and there was a park down there. And so we walked through the park, and the moon was shining, and so there was a little stream there and had a little curved bridge over it, rustic and we stood there on the bridge, and we talked and talked and talked about deep things. I don't remember what it was.
Then we sung a song.
Yeah,
We were only
on the
walking.
way back we sang a song. And he said, but it was very romantic to me. And I guess to him too, because the next day, another lady that had an apartment in there had talked to Wade, or her husband had talked to Wade, and he said that I was the most intelligent conversationalist that he had ever dated. And I thought, well, I didn't really say that much. But anyway, then as we were coming home, when we left the bridge, well, they had swings there, and I don't remember if we swung in the swings or not. But then it was about 2 blocks away from Betty's house, and we came back. But before we got out of the park, well, one of us started singing, We Were Only Walking in the Moonlight. And so you want us to sing?
I was about to ask you to. Sing it for us.
Okay, Dad. Okay.
We were only walking in the moonlight, and before we knew what the moon could do, we were falling in love, and we were only talking in the moonlight, and the sigh we sighed only signified we were falling in love. Just a casual meeting, just a casual glance, and our hearts began beating to the tune of romance. And we were only walking in the moonlight, and before we knew what the moon could do, we were falling in love.
Okay.
Now, that was our song, and we don't want to go deeply into details on our meeting and greeting and courtship, but that gives you a background of what happened, and we did go to a little show, a tent show, and heard
Gene Austin
sing.
He was.
We enjoyed that.
And that was also in the park.
And that was kind of a romantic adventure.
Gene
And
Austin.
we heard him sing, and we loved him because it was natural.
Gene Austin was a
He's a
star.
crooner.
He was a crooner. He was the first Bing Crosby.
He sung.
And so we went down there, and he sang. He was the one that made My Blue Heaven famous. And
In a shady nook by a babbling brook. In other words, he knew how to croon. And
Yeah.
we just loved it. It wasn't a strong voice, but it was a beautiful, mellow voice. So we loved that. Okay?
okay.
One more question about you two before Sarah was born. Grandpa's already told us that about when y'all got married, you hadn't read a book, didn't have a career except dancing. Tell me about your economic situation at the time Sarah was born, which must have been 2 or 3 years after you were married.
Yeah.
What did you do?
Well, I guess I could tell that part because inasmuch as for all those years, up to 20, say 20 plus or minus, I did not have a trade or a profession or a vocation. And I didn't realize at the time how inadequate that was. And my dear mother was involved in a dream. And often and through her years, she had a blessing that she would dream a dream of reality, and it would have meaning. And in this case, she said, I had a dream. And I dreamed that Wade had a good job. And that it was a soft job, he had a necktie on, so to speak. In other words, a white collar job. And I couldn't feature that. But later on, the application was passed around for manager of a recreation hall. And prior to that, I'd never paid tithing. Just like I say, I never had. And I felt the urge to pay tithing. And I prayed a kind of a silent prayer that I could get the job in conjunction with my mother's dream. And I made a kind of a pact with the Lord. I made a contract. It wasn't vanity. It was just simply that if you'll help me get this job, I'll start paying tithing, and I'll pay it as long as I live. So I made that pledge or pact with the Lord, and on my part, I didn't get the Lord. He didn't get to send me a revelation that He would comply, but I did get the job, and it was lucky that I did, because the other fellow had more experience and was interviewed. But I got the job, just like my mother's dream. And that's the first big jump I ever had in my life of making even approach a living wage. At that time in 38, right at the tail end of the Depression, before the big war got involved, World War II, I received as my first salary $100 a month, and it was a privilege to belong to the Line Oil Refining Company Recreation Hall. They had bought a great big hall, put pool halls in there, finished
ping pong
tables and a lot of other things.
Had dances there.
Had monthly dances for the company and meetings and stuff, and I supervised and keep it clean up, and I'd feed them, and I did that in conjunction with my $100 a month. So that left us with room enough to get married and kind of live,
That's
rent.
What he was doing. Rent was $25 a month.
So you see, I didn't make much. I'd get a check every 2 weeks, and I'd carry $5 worth of groceries in a sack. I didn't have a car. I'd throw it across my shoulder and walk several miles to our apartment. And I didn't think anything about it. When we rented a house there, an apartment rather, I would take off and I'd run. I'd run home, right through the woods till I got home. So those early days in the 38 and 39 and 40 and 41, there was still not much money. $1 was $1, and it went a long way.
$200 a month was really to be envied.
Well, you could own a home with $200,
and a car.
And we couldn't own a home. So anyway, here we got a raise to $105 a month. Finally, we heard about the war coming on, and we heard about Orange, Texas being where they're going to build 6 destroyers and more ships to go beyond that. And the war and they paid big wages.
50 cents an hour.
50 cents an hour was big wages. And I started out as a helper, and I was beginning to learn a trade where I could make a living, which was at that time a boilermaker in its infancy, a special apprentice. So I took blueprints and studied it, and at night, and that augmented my income a little bit. Didn't give me little raises, but I never had big money. I just had early days of Sarah's life. I'll go back to her first, second, third, fourth, fifth year. I didn't make very much money. I mean, it was nip and tuck financially. And in a way, you'd say, well, you sacrificed or you suffered. But we always paid our tithing with no reservation, no problem, no challenge, no temptation not to pay it. We just paid it. For 60 plus years, 65 years nearly, we've done just that because I agreed with the Lord, and the Lord was kind and He reciprocated. And now today, we do all right in our sunset years financially. We don't aspire to a beautiful home, a penthouse. We don't aspire to a Cadillac or a supercar. We don't.
Park Avenue.
Huh?
I said Park Avenue. Be honest.
Just to be comfortable. The air conditioning is fine. We could do a lot to our house and make improvements and doctor it up and renovate, change carpets, all of this. But we're comfortable with it, and we don't aspire to much more financially, even though we think we could afford it. The Lord continues to bless us. We have several incomes now. The Lord's been kind. He gave us retirement from school teaching, from pipe fitters, from veteran administration, and Social Security. And at this period in time is the richest era in all history when you can receive a goodly income and it's legitimate and honest. That's through Social Security. So we have all of that. And barring sickness or disease where it would take overnight, take all you have, we're doing all right financially. So, but in the early days of Sarah, we had very little. We had an old rugged home. We had to build it out of 1-6s rough lumber, and instead of shiplap, we would lap it so that the rain would hit the sides and fall down, down, down. It cascade down. And that's all we had. I didn't know how to put a window in.
No, it said one time that we could have thrown, we didn't have to throw a cat out the window, we could throw it out anywhere.
But we had an old wood stove and a lean-to and
that was
crude. Finally, we did get a homemade bathroom tub.
all the children were born while we lived
In
in
humble circumstances, just as crude. And,
3 of them, but Spencer was born to this house.
So there you are. If that's what you wanted to know, we're happy to share that with you.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to know. Okay, well, tell me briefly about one more question I have about the church. To what extent did the members of the church, and I'm talking about during Sarah's early years, interact with non-members of the church? Was the Williamson settlement more like a sub-community, or were they really quite integrated with the rest of the
We were
group?
known, it was known as a Mormon community. And,
More strongly than today.
and it was like all of our recreation was done. Every Tuesday night we went down to the church. It was MIA night, and then in those days they had MIA from September till May. But we would have it all summer long. We played volleyball out on the church grounds, and we'd have play nights every Tuesday night, and everybody would come out, big crowds.
And dances.
And
Lots of dances.
Had lots of dances, and people would come from Silsbee and on up the road. You know, Mormons from wherever would come when we had one, and they would dance out there on the slab, and they would sweat until they would, not a dry thread on them, But they were serious about that dancing, and
But we at that time had MIA on Tuesday night, and the Baptists had their devotional on Wednesday, a prayer meeting. So our Orland Portee made a suggestion that we can coordinate by moving it to Wednesday night, so we could be in harmony with when the kids, get off from school and
school
go to
honored
their
Wednesday
church,
night.
and
as
we'd
prayer
harmonize
meeting.
with them. And that it didn't make us any difference, so we moved it to Wednesday night. We've held that a long time.
You've kind of answered the question, but did you all feel connected with the other saints in Silsbee and Fred and the other?
Yeah.
Very much so. We were bonded to them because they were just like next door neighbors. They knew us by name, backwards and forwards nickname, and we'd have socials. We'd take it up there on our own. It wasn't sponsored inter-ward. We'd just go up there and put on a show because they liked to see our talent. We'd put on a show and a talent show, and but we were bonded with Silsbee and Beaumont and even Port Arthur to a certain extent. They knew we were here, and we were Lake Charles. We knew all about them, way over there, 65 miles. We knew their condition, and they knew about us. We were bonded.
When Sarah was 11 and Bremen Baker was 11, well, we had a New Year's dance in Beaumont at the Woodman's Hall, And I was over it at that time. I was working in the dance committee, and I was over that, and so we secured a hall, and we'd have New Year's dance, but we would have it on New Year's Day, the night of New Year's Day, because we didn't want to be out on the drunken highway on New Year's Eve. And besides, everything was real expensive on New Year's Eve, so we could get a band real cheap, and we could get the hall real cheap. And so we went on New Year's Day. And we took Sarah, and Raymond Baker's family took him. And he was a dancer, and she was a dancer. And so they danced, but they never looked at one another. It was like they looked down at the floor, but they danced the whole set. And they were this
and they
far
were great
apart.
dancers.
And turned out then later on, they both of them became
But
great dancers.
make no mistake about it, even though we were few in number, scattered, Sylvie and even Odom up there, we were not only bonded, but we had the same testimonies and the same spirit and the same lesson subject matter, and we felt those strong feelings that we feel today. When you have a EFY now, we had those same things, only on a smaller scale. There's no difference. That spirit was predominantly the same. So there was no pioneer devoid there. It was really strong.
You were saying, is there anything else about that dancing between those two kiddos?
No, there really wasn't no story between them. They just both wanted to dance. And I saw him not too long ago, and I said, "You remember you and Sarah danced?" He said, "Yeah, I remember that." But he was not struck with her, nor she with him. Neither one of them had feelings other than that they wanted to dance. But I wanted to mention here that people from here married people from Odom, and the saints knew where everybody was, and they were intermarrying saints a lot. Of that was going on. And one of Sarah's first beaux was from, if we want to go through that, we can talk, Kenneth Hutto and Silsby. And they didn't see each other often, but...
Well, prior to that, she had a non-member to show you in answer to your question about non-members, how we related to them. Sarah dated Bobby, what's his last name?
Young.
Bobby Young. And I still recall a little episode, and it's intriguing what happened. They were on this couch, and I was in the bed, but I was interested and alert and aware of everything that I could hear, and I could hear pretty good then. But they laughed and visited and cackled with such exuberance and innocence as a young couple. They say, I believe from the first date or the second, they had 2 or 3 dates. But they were on this couch and they'd stay up late. But you could feel the innocence and the purity in the air. Even though he was non-member and he was solid in his own religion, and Sarah on her and hers, they had an interaction of congeniality that brought the non-members, I say the Protestants, to tolerate the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints. I wanted to inject that because I could see that on a local level, but we were distinctly more so than ever in those early years. They were Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and everything. They were completely a different group, and we were. We just did. One time we had a merry mix-up of their singing. They wanted to come down to our chapel and sing old Baptist songs. And we got to singing with them. And one of the apostles came down and he says, "Don't do it." Even though that's good social, climate and building good relations, says, don't do it. Because you're going to be influenced with them. So that was the only episode we ever had to intermingle with the other religions, even in song. but we was strictly LDS all through it all the years.
And I taught the girls that, and Marshall too, you can date non-members if you behave, but it's not serious. It's not serious. And then sometimes, I know with Rachel, I would say it's time to break up, and she would break up. She's been going with one guy for about 6 months. I said, that's long enough. And she's, okay. I said, you don't want to give your heart away to someone and not marry him in the temple. So and she liked that guy a lot. But she talked to him about the church and asked him if he knew it was true, would he join? He said no. And she said, well, that's it. But I know we're ahead of ourselves.
Well, that's all right.
Well, we go back to Sarah whenever she was little.
Well, let me read you the paragraph and let you guys just talk.
Okay.
It's what was Sarah's early childhood like? With whom did she play? What did she like to do? What was a normal day like? And then describe the 2 close calls, when she fell in a burning stump and then when she got her arm caught in the washing machine or whatever.
Well, I'll yield that to Grandma and let Mother remark about that, because she knows exactly what happened, and I knew some of the things, so she'll be best at that.
It started out down there, and we were living down here across from the Wallace place, and the house is empty now, across from our rent house where the Cole girl lives now. And we had a little house there, and she was about 2 years old. And we had the Arringtons. Fred Arrington was living to our right, and Weldon Wallace family was living back up there where, behind Richard's house there, where Hal LaPrey stayed for a while. Anyway, that location, the Wallace family lived there. And they had children her age. They had a little boy named Jimmy, and the Arringtons had Luella. And so she played with them and just loved to get out and play in the dirt. That was the big thing, is play in the dirt. And they would, and Molly, she would go across this field, and there wasn't any trees in here then, and she'd walk across that field and go see Molly down at Hetzel's when she was about 3, and that was her good friends then. They were dear friends to her. And when she was, when Marshall was born, and he was a tiny baby, 6 weeks old. Well, Aunt Grace and Uncle Monk they were crazy about Sarah, and they were acting grandparents for her. And so when I had to go to town or tend to Marshall, well, they would keep her. They would keep her anytime I wanted to do something else. They loved to keep her. And so at this time, I think we had taken Marshall to the doctor for something, probably circumcision or something like that. And when we came back, well, we were going to pick up Sarah. She had been staying with Aunt Grace. And she ran to see us, and she was also out. I believe that had happened just before we got there, hadn't it? When we got there, she had already, but Ellis was there. He stayed at Maggie's a lot, and he cleared land, and he was clearing the land, and he was burning stumps, and burning the timber and so on. And he had an old stump that needed to be burnt out, and he had set a fire to it, and it had burned where it looked like it was finished.
Coals were under.
Yeah, there was coals underneath, but on top it looked like ground. And
Dark.
so she was running to Ellis, and so as she ran right across that stump hole and just fell down on those coals. And So she started screaming. They pulled her out, and she was burned up to here, but she had on little sandals, and that's where the worst burn was sustained, on her feet, and you could see where the leather had been across her toes and around her heel, and the rest of it was really charred. And
The rest of what, her legs?
of her foot,
Top of her foot,
her
more,
foot,
actually.
and just a little bit of her leg down to here. But it seemed like there was something up there because later on it showed up. But so we grabbed her up and took her. There was a DO inviter named Gribble, Dr. Gribble, and we took her to him. And he was not a burn specialist. He didn't know what to do, but he had some kind of ointment or something, a lotion, that he poured it all over her legs and wrapped them up and said, leave it for a week and then bring it back and he'd see how she's doing. Well, she started running a high fever before the week was out. And so Aunt Grace says you need to get her to a real doctor. And so we went to Beaumont and we got Dr. Chun. And he said, well, I've got a young doctor here named Jacobson who's just home from the war, and he's had a lot of experience with burns, so we'll let him see it. So he looked at it, and he said, it's a real bad burn. We need to put her in the hospital. And it was infected. So we put her in the hospital. And we stayed there for several days, and Wade and I were staying around the clock. And Dr. Jacobson was coming and looking at it. And so he said, well, you know, say on Friday or certain day, I want you to bring her by the office from here, and said, we'll look at it, and if it is okay, you can go on home. If it's not okay, we'll have to come back. And he did start giving her penicillin, which was not, we had never heard of penicillin before. He had used it in the war. And so it was administered every 3 hours with a shot in the buttocks. And so she would hear that, and she was 2. She's 2 and 3 months. And she would hear that nurse coming down the hall, her feet would clunk, clank, clank, and she'd start screaming, oh, mean nurse, stick in my bottom. Oh, mean nurse, stick in my bottom, and crying and screaming. And we'd have to hold her down, and it's all we could do to get her to take those shots every 3 hours. And so we were hopeful that when we went back to see the doctor's office, that he would tell us that she's okay, you can take her home. But when he took the bandage off, it was gangrene. It was in her.
Smell it.
In her feet, right across the instep. And he showed it to us, the little red dots in white. And so, and then as he, we also, up here she had gangrene right close to her knee. He said, you know, it's bad news, and you have to put her back in the hospital. But he was not hopeful. And as we were in there and suffering the agonies of losing a child. And so Uncle Van came by. He was our branch president. And he came by and visited us. And I think we had prayer and all, and then he left. And about an hour, well, the nurse came in and said, your pastor is here. Would you like to see him? And we said, well, our pastor's already been here, gone. Well, he said he's your pastor, and he knows your name, and all. We said, well, show him in. And it was Brother Glenn Smith. Glenn G. Smith.
About
he
6
he
foot,
brother to the prophet, wasn't he?
half
Robert.
brother to George Albert Smith,
And so
mission president,
he said,
brand new.
I got up this morning and I had an urge to come to Williamson, but I didn't know why. But when I got to church, said the brethren were having circle prayer for this little child. And he said that I knew why the Lord had sent me. And so
He said they told him, you can't get in there.
yeah,
It's forbidden.
he said,
He said, I'll get in.
and so
And he did.
he came in and she had a fever, and the doctor told me, said if we can keep the fever from coming back, we've got a chance. But if the fever comes back, well, he didn't say, but it was like, that's the bad.
It's bad news.
And so he came in and gave her a blessing. And I don't remember what he said.
Well, I don't remember except that when he got his hands laid it off, the fever was gone.
She was sweating.
She was sweating.
When he took his
Fever
hands
broke.
off.
He was sweating.
She,
She began to mend it well.
and, so,
And then, I guess many years ago, 15 years later, we went on a vacation to Salt Lake, and we went to a Sunday school in downtown Salt Lake. And Sarah went in with the teenagers, and who was teaching the teenagers? Ex-mission president Glenn G. Smith. He didn't know. And Sarah called attention to the blessing, and he was excited. A meeting.
I don't know exactly how that
And
happened.
Glenn G. Smith then invited us, whereupon with his wife, to his home, and we chatted. He told us a lot of lovely things. But he crossed paths with Sarah, and Sarah had to remind him of that little girl in that hospital. Oh, it's touching. Because, see, and then subsequent to that, or after that, not too long when she got well, she put her hand in this old washing machine feeding clothes, the one that got two round ringers, the rolls, squeezes out the water. She stuck her hand in there and it began to roll up and tore off some of the meat up here. And then Jesse Kirkpatrick was the district president and held the priesthood, and he came down here. And I remember his words in his blessing. I bless you, as severe as it was and as scarred as it was later. Bless you to a complete recovery. And that was about all he said. And it was a complete recovery. The Lord had his hand on her, even with all those traumatic experiences. So anyway, I want to add that little episode.
That was a real hard time because I had a brand new baby, Marshall, and he wasn't digesting his food, and he's spitting
Burping
up,
up, spitting up.
crying all the time. And every day I had, they called it some kind of water. I had to bathe her feet in this water and poured it over the bandage, and it really was Clorox water, you know. Had to do that and dress it. And then the day that I took the bandage off her feet, well, she ran her arm through the ringer. And she was a real active little girl. One time we went to see Mama, and she was, we liked to surprise Mama. We wouldn't tell her we were coming. We just
Drop in.
Just drop in. And so we liked to see her, go on about, oh, I can't believe you kids are here. And so when she was greeting us, we drove our car up to her little house, which was on an oil lease. And so she had a little shanty there. And so she ran out in the yard to hug us and greet us, and I didn't know you were coming, and da-da-da. And we said, where's Sarah? So she had run in the house as soon as she got there. And Mama said, she went in and found her and said, she's unpacking. she had gone to her sewing machine and pulled out all the drawers and had all the threads and the needles and everything that was in those drawers out on the floor.
She was noted for unpacking.
Oh, she was.
It was just like it was a duty.
She got right into it and was.
Now, one little sidelight is not a sidelight even. It's just something that Sarah, I recall vividly. I remember her positive attitude. Even as a little child, she was cheerful, smiling. And the hard knocks, the rains, the sleet, the snow, nothing marred her little sweet disposition, even in the early tender years when she was 3 or 4 years old. When she was about 3 or 4 years old, she had the prettiest curly little hair, like a little movie, like Shirley Temple. You know, it was in little ringlets all the way down, and she was the prettiest little baby girl that ever lived at that one particular time. She got up in teenagers and changed a few nomenclature, your body change and all. But at that time, I still remember. And then the highlight of it is, one time Grandma and Grandpa, we had a little discord, little differences. And so we started off to church, trying to subdue our emotions began to rise, you know. The tactful way to say it. But Sarah had such a sweet little countenance and grabbed our hands with such loving sweetness to go to church gleefully and gladly, like you just can't imagine. I can still steer. She subdued our spirits. She had a bearing on the way we felt and helped us to normalize, because without saying a word, because that little gleeful way that when she went about, and always was that way. She was always laughing, smiling. And I remember when they got married, and you take those pictures of Bernie and Sarah when they honeymooned through the mountains, there was nothing but joyful glee. And I want to tell you one more thing while I'm in that vein about Sarah. Even in her family years, when she had a large family, and I don't mind sharing this. I don't think it's out of order to share it. I had asked various and sundry ones. I'd ask them, in a temple interview, I'd say, well, how happy are you on A, B, C, or what? And I've got some of them would say B, a B minus, when I thought they were an A. Well, that's beside the point. But Sarah Packard is the only person, married or unmarried, that I ever interviewed or took a survey on, officially or formally or as the Lord would have it. It gave me a resounding A+. And I thought that reflected all of her years from day one. Her countenance was a happy. And Spencer W. Kimball said, no unhappy person will go to the celestial kingdom of God, I guess truly unhappy. But I can say that as far as Sarah is concerned, she was a happy person all her days.
I think we'll end there for tonight.
We got some more time.
Well, we're just about out of time, believe it or not. We're
Okay.
50 minutes in here. You want to go a few
I've
more
got
minutes?
one little story to tell,
Sure.
which is kind of a confession on my part. But she was just a little thing about 3 years old, and I had a locket on a gold string. I guess it was gold, and I treasured that locket, and I told her not to fool with it. And she took it to Molly's and lost it. And so when I was looking for it, I said, "What happened to the locket?" my locket's gone. And I caught on that she knew something about it, but she said, I said, did you have it? No, I didn't. And I said, and finally, though, she admitted that she had it. And I was furious. And I was not, this is something you don't tell on yourself. But anyway, I said, Sarah, you don't tell a lie. No, you don't tell a story. I wouldn't use the word lie because I'm afraid she wouldn't understand what that was. I said, whenever you do something, then if someone asks you, you have to say yes. You have to admit it when you've done it. You never tell a story. And she says, and I said, and I want you to remember that. Do you remember that? She said, yeah, I remember. I said, okay, now I'm going to put you in the rat house. And we had a little feed house there that kept our feed for our chickens and so forth. And I said, I'm going to put you in the rat house because you told that. And if you ever do it again, you'll go back in it too. And I left her in there about 5 seconds. You know, I put her in there and I closed the door and she screamed. And so I let her out then, and I felt so bad, and I was so worried that really a rat might come out, you know, and see her. But anyhow, I took her out, and then I loved her and told her, you know, that this is to help you remember that you never tell a story. Okay? So she went on to primary, and they were having a 24th thing. It was sometime after that. And Aunt Dealey asked her, says, Sarah, now, for the program, we want you to tell a Bible story. I can't do that. She says, oh, yes, you can. Your mom will teach you one. You can give it. No, I won't do that. And she says, well, why won't you do it? She says, my mama said I must never tell a story. So she had
on the last minute or two, let me give you one more thing about Sarah that's impressive as you reflect on it and meditate it. How she could handle tragedy or death with such maturity as a teenager. And I have to call attention to precisely what happened. When Preston, a neighbor, was shot and killed. Robert Arrington was shot. A young teenager, a good friend. They danced together and they were good friends. I can still recall her coming in and announcing that to me. Burst that news. Preston was shot. And she said, Daddy. And she said it in such sympathy and such maturity, I can't describe it. And then later on, when our own little Spencer was run over in front of our house, I was asleep in that north quarters there. And I was asleep, and I heard screaming, but I didn't know what it was. I heard yelling. In my sleep, I heard it. It was so strong out on the street. I knew later that's what it was. And Sarah burst into my room and used those immortal words which reflected her maturity as a teenager. She reconciled and she said, Daddy, Spencer's been hit, but he's still breathing. See, that little phrase, he's still breathing, gave me hope to go out on the street to see him. And it was hopeless that he was taken to realms of deity. But Sarah's announcement, and then thereafter, our kids, all of them, all three that were remaining, Marshall, Sarah, and we would have circle family prayer here many times with broken, sobbing hearts. But they, including Sarah, was extremely mature and understanding and reconciled with death at an early age. It was with such maturity. I want to pay tribute to Sarah in that advanced stage of maturity in her faculties.
Thank you.
You finished your